Welcome to the College Neuro Network, a podcast series part of Simply Neuroscience's The Synapse. My name is Sarah.
And my name is Sasha, and we're your hosts for today. The College Neuro Network has discussions with undergraduate students studying neuroscience and neuroscience professors in order to gain insight into the neuroscience departments and opportunities of the nation's top universities.
Today's episode is focused on Yale University, a private Ivy League research university in New Haven, Connecticut. With its hundreds of study, research, and internship opportunities, passionate student body, and diverse curriculum, Yale ranks number 3 in national universities by the U.S. News and World Report.
Today, joining us is Professor Crystal, Junior Professor of Translational Research and Professor of Psychiatry and Neuroscience at Yale University. Beyond teaching, a couple of other impressive hats Professor Crystal wears include the co-director of the Yale Center for Clinical Investigation, chairman of the Department of Psychiatry, and the director of the NIAAA Center for Translational Neuroscience of Alcoholism at the Yale School of Medicine. Welcome, Professor Crystal. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss your experiences as a professor at Yale.
Thank you so much, Sasha.
All right, so first, can you please briefly introduce yourself and tell us what sparked your interest in both neuroscience and psychiatry?
Sure. So, as you've heard, I'm John Crystal. I'm the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Yale, and I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Neuroscience and in the Department of Psychology. My interest in psychiatry was stimulated greatly when I was in college, and when I had a strong interest in music, and some of the people that I knew who were involved in music had problems with drug abuse. And so I was interested in the problem of drug abuse when I entered college. And so I spent the summer after my first year in college working in a methadone clinic, helping out people who were getting treatment for their opiate dependency. When I came back to college, I was taking a biochemistry course. And during the biochemistry course, the teacher mentioned that there was a new discovery. And that new discovery was that the body made chemicals that were similar to opiates, and that those opiates, endogenous opiates, worked by binding to particular receptor targets in the brain. And for me, that was a kind of click moment where I realized that the kinds of clinical problems that I was interested in had a basis in the biochemistry of the brain. And so I tried to combine in my career biochemistry-oriented research and medication-oriented research to try to link basic neuroscience to the clinical neuroscience of psychiatric disorders. That's kind of what got me started, in that passion of linking basic and clinical research has been a driving theme in my career.
Wow, that sounds amazing. What does your day-to-day life as a professor at Yale look like? Like, what are some of your responsibilities?
Well, as chair of the Department of Psychiatry, a lot of my daily activities are involved in meeting with people in the department. I meet with the students, I meet with the faculty, I meet with the leaders of other departments, I meet with leaders of the medical school. So a lot of my day is spent in meetings. But I devote as much time as I can to my research activities. And my research activities these days are along those lines, trying to link the biochemistry of psychiatric disorders to their neural circuitry using brain imaging technologies and to treatments. And I've been studying, I started out studying addiction, but I moved to other psychiatric disorders like depression and schizophrenia and post-traumatic stress disorder and alcoholism.
Great. So our next question for you is, what really drew you to becoming or working at Yale specifically in comparison to other institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was in college, I went to college at the University of Chicago, which was a wonderful place to study. And I worked in a basic neuroscience laboratory, and I worked in clinical research as well. I went one year when I was in college, I went to a scientific meeting, and I heard a presentation from somebody who was presenting research that suggested that they could develop a new drug. This is a professor from Yale, Dr. Mark Gold. He's not at Yale anymore, but an important alumnus of our department. But he's described how teams of people got together, a basic neuroscientist recording the electrical activity of particular areas of the brain, and pharmacologists developing drugs to target that area of the brain, and psychiatrists who found that that drug, when given to people who were going through opiate withdrawal, could suppress opiate withdrawal symptoms by suppressing the activity of this part of the brain. And that treatment turned out to be a novel treatment for opiate withdrawal called clonidine. So this, to my knowledge, was the first time in any area of psychiatry where there was a clear basic neuroscience mechanism that could translate into a treatment. And for me, that was really exciting. And so I decided to go to Yale first for medical school, and then I stayed on for residency and for my academic career. I came to Yale in 1980. It's now 40 years later, and I'm as excited about being here in this community as I was 40 years ago.
That's so amazing. Yeah. So our next question for you, I guess, is, so you talked a little bit about why you chose Yale specifically. So we were wondering if you could elaborate on what you think makes Yale psychiatry and like neuroscience departments different from other universities.
Yale psychiatry is a bit different from other departments of psychiatry. It has a tradition of basic neuroscience and clinical neuroscience working together, a tradition that goes all the way back to the 1950s. And that means that the Department of Psychiatry had a kind of culture of science, of scientific values and scientific approaches that was deeply ingrained and extended to large parts of our department community, and also a tradition of collaboration of basic scientists and clinical neuroscientists working together. And that tradition, which was established back in the 50s and developed in the 60s, is nurtured in part because there's a very special, almost unique structure for the neuroscience program in psychiatry at Yale. There's a floor at the Connecticut Mental Health Center, which is a state of Connecticut supported institution that collaborates with Yale. And one half of the floor are basic neuroscience laboratories, animal research, cellular research, other kinds of things. On the other side of the floor is a clinical research unit. And so they're right across the hall from each other. And that kind of juxtaposition of basic and clinical research, which is very unusual, helped to drive this kind of culture of what we call translational neuroscience. Now there's a much larger neuroscience community at Yale. There's a wonderful department of neuroscience and neurosurgery and neurology and genetics. And Yale is in terms of the campus, it's very compact. We're all kind of close together and interacting. So some of my important mentors and teachers, for example, were not necessarily in the Department of Psychiatry. So for example, one of my mentors was a primate cognitive neuroscientist named Patricia Goldman-Rakic, who was discovering functions of the prefrontal cortex in non-human primates. And her work influenced my work a lot and shaped a lot of what we do in the context of our schizophrenia research. And so it was not just the community of the Department of Psychiatry, but the whole broader community. Nowadays, I have collaborations in psychiatry, but also collaborations in neurosurgery, in collaborations with the people of the Department of Neuroscience, collaborations with people in the School of Public Health and in statistical genomics and neuroimaging, and collaborations with the Department of Psychology. We're a broad community, but we really are very interactive, and that is a really special thing. There aren't walls or silos or barriers that keep people out. Generally speaking, it's an incredibly kind of lively and interactive environment, which makes it really fun.
Great. That's incredible how intertwined everything is, like even physically, like you were saying, on the same floor. But that's really incredible how it's like very collaborative, and neuroscience is already so interdisciplinary, but then to have all these other psychiatry, clinical neuroscience, neurosurgery, like all of this coming together is just absolutely incredible. So our next question for you is, so I know you're like the chair, so you might not be in the classroom setting all the time, but if you could talk about whether neuroscience and psychiatry classes at Yale are more like lecture-based or discussion-based.
There is a wide range of types of classes, and I teach in neuroscience courses, I teach in psychiatry courses. I don't think I've taught in neurology courses, but I have taught in cognitive neuroscience programs more broadly. So there's a wide range of types of courses. My favorite courses that I teach are two kind of linked courses. In one course, I give a lecture about the basic biology and treatment of psychosis and cognitive impairments associated with schizophrenia, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects brain function. In the other part of that course, I interview a patient in front of the entire first-year medical student class. And so there are maybe 100 people in the room. The patient and I are talking to each other. I'm asking them questions about their experience. And then at the end of the interview, the medical students get a chance to ask the patient all kinds of questions about things they heard about schizophrenia, about their things the patient said or things that I said. And you never know what's going to happen in that class. It's really incredibly engaging, and it's so important for people to learn about these problems by seeing them close up. I think it's really extremely helpful.
Yeah, that's incredible. I've never even thought of a class that could be structured like that, where students are actively engaging with like an actual patient in a classroom setting. That's really cool. And so I guess you kind of answered our next question, which was, what was your favorite class to teach? So Sarah, if you want to take it away with the next question.
So we wanted to talk a little bit more about your research. So I know your research largely focuses on like neuroimaging, neurobiology, and computational neuroscience, and how they can be used to treat disorders such as alcoholism, PTSD, schizophrenia, and depression, which sounds really fascinating and interesting. And we were wondering if you could expand a little more on the research you are currently conducting and the intersection between the different topics you've conducted research on so far.
Sure. Well, I think there are kind of three styles of research careers. One, where you have a particular technique and you apply that technique to all kinds of things. A second, where you are interested in a particular illness or disorder, and you study everything about those disorders. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't seem to be either of those two kinds of person. I'm a person who's driven by question. In other words, I'm really interested in developing a theory or a model about what's going wrong in the brain that could account for the symptoms and cognitive impairments and circuit dysfunctions that we see in psychiatric disorders. So one of the phrases that you use, which I'm really interested in, is something called computational neuroscience. And what computational neuroscience is, in this respect for me, is a way to think about, develop models that you can test in very rigorous ways. And we can use computational models to get ideas about how circuits in the brain are regulated, because we give these computational models the properties of actual brain circuits. And that helps us to have our ideas about the biology of psychiatric disorders link both to animal research and to other kinds of clinical research, because we can test out some of the ideas that are coming from these various sources and put them in these computational models and then get some ideas. And then then we use, as you mentioned, a variety of brain imaging techniques to look at the structure of the brain, to look at the function of different circuits of the brain, and to look at the chemistry of the brain using techniques like magnetic resonance spectroscopy and positron emission tomography. All we're trying to be able to do is to ask the same kinds of questions in people, in healthy people and in patients, that one would want to do in conducting neuroscience research in animals. Because if you can't ask those same kinds of questions in people, you really can't harness the incredible breakthroughs that have been made in basic neuroscience to solve the problems of illness. So let me just tell you about one story about that.
Okay.
I've been studying a particular system of the brain. This is called glutamate. And the glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter of the brain. Maybe 80% or 70% of the synaptic connections in the brain involve glutamate. One of my colleagues was a depression researcher named Dr. Dennis Charney. He's now at the Icahn School of Medicine in Mount Sinai. And his research was on the biology of depression, studying, you might say, the more traditional systems, serotonin, norepinephrine. These are the drugs targeted by drugs like Prozac. And his research had hit a kind of conceptual crisis. Depleting the body of serotonin and norepinephrine didn't make people depressed. And so we thought, well, what if depression lived in the higher centers of the brain, like the cortex and the limbic system, areas involved in thought and emotion? Then it would mean that depression worked via different kinds of chemical messengers, not serotonin and norepinephrine, but things like glutamate and GABA. So we thought, well, what if we targeted the glutamate system with a drug? And the drug we chose to probe the glutamate system was a drug that I had been the major focus of my research at that time, a drug called ketamine, which was used as an anesthetic drug at the time. So we gave a single dose of ketamine to depressed patients to probe the integrity of glutamate synaptic communication. And what we found, which was really remarkable, is that people got better from their depression within 24 hours of a single dose of ketamine. And that, I could tell you about years of studies that we did and other people did that worked out the mechanism and replicated the effect. But the bottom line is that this drug, which we tested to manipulate the glutamate system, is now an available treatment for depression. It's called esketamine or Spravato, and it's given via a nasal spray. So we can use neuroscience to have a transformative effect in how we think about these disorders and about how we treat these disorders, coming up with new treatments that work overnight instead of over several months, and that can reach and help people who can't be helped with the standard treatments. And that is incredibly rewarding. I mean, it's just a wonderful thing to hear from people who benefit from this treatment, which came out of this simple idea that if you can study, if you can link the basic brain mechanisms that are worked out in animal neuroscience research to human neurobiology, then you can discover new things about the disorders and how to treat them.
That sounds amazing. We were wondering, where do you think, or where would you like to see your research go in the future? Like, is there any one thing that you want to specifically study sometime in the future? Sure.
Well, there is one of the things that we're studying. There's lots of things that I'm studying. That the brain. Someone told me that the brain is the most complicated structure in the entire universe. And so there are huge gaps in our understanding of the brain, and huge, even bigger gaps maybe in our understanding of the biology and treatment of neurologic and psychiatric disorders. But one of the questions that grabbed me when I was starting my career, this would probably be around 1990, 1989, something like that. And it was the first time I was giving this drug, ketamine, to a human. And then we gave it in low doses. And I remember that it was producing some of the signs and symptoms. Briefly, they went away, but producing some of the signs and symptoms in healthy people that we saw in people with schizophrenia. And I'm still trying to figure out why that is. I think answering that question is like climbing a big mountain. Every few years, the studies that we are doing and other people are doing help to shed a little bit more light on why ketamine can produce circuit changes and behavioral changes that are a little bit similar to what you see in schizophrenia. But I'd like that work to have the same kind of successful outcome that the depression work. In other words, I'd like to take these increasingly sophisticated models of circuit dysfunction in schizophrenia and develop a new treatment that reaches the people with schizophrenia that we haven't been able to reach so far. And there are other things that we're doing that are just taking off now that are incredibly exciting. In the area of post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. We are in the process of completing the first molecular and brain analysis in postmortem brain tissue of the neurobiology of PTSD. This kind of work has been done in schizophrenia and in depression and other disorders for more than a decade, maybe 15 years in meaningful ways. But we just established a brain tissue collection and are doing these first analyses. And I think all kinds of wonderful, new, exciting areas are starting to come out of this deeper understanding of the biology of post-traumatic stress disorder. And seeing that through is a really exciting project as well.
In your experience, how accessible are research opportunities for undergraduate students at Yale?
They're wonderfully accessible. The Yale undergraduates are a remarkably bright and talented crew. And so the faculty are very pleased to have these undergraduates in their labs during the school year or during the summer for short-term projects or for longer-term projects. It's really easy. We've had undergraduates in the labs that I've overseen, and it's great. It's really a wonderful experience for them and great fun for us as well.
That's amazing. Yeah. So both me and Sarah are actually rising seniors right now. So we're in the process of looking at colleges, and that's like really important for us to know how accessible research opportunities are, especially for undergraduates. So that's amazing to hear. Real quick, I just had a question about your research that I kind of want to go back to. So yes. You mentioned how, or prior, we didn't really look at GABA or glutamate. We instead looked at like serotonin, and like most of the antidepressants are like SSRIs or SNRIs, I believe, right? So I researched that a little bit, and I know that like SSRIs and SNRIs sometimes shrink specific regions of the brain, regions that tend to be like larger with people who have depression. So I was wondering if your research saw that, like if you saw that like targeting GABA or glutamate resulted in some shrinkage of certain regions of the brain as well.
Well, this is kind of one of the exciting parts of the story. So I'm going to focus rather on the size of the brain, on what I think is a critical building block for psychiatric disorders, which are the synaptic connections between nerve cells. So one of our colleagues developed a PET radio tracer that targets the ends of neurons, the axon terminals. And so using this PET radio tracer, my colleague Irina Esterlis in her laboratory did a study in severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder showing that according to this PET tracer, the synaptic connections and areas in the brain involved in mood and cognition were decreased a little bit. And that was really a kind of a foundational observation, because my colleague, the late Ronald Duman at Yale, in his basic animal research showed that in the animal models, the antidepressant effect of ketamine was associated with a rapid regrowth of synaptic connections to the brain. Within hours, within a day, that the lost synaptic connections due to stress, chronic stress, would regrow. And so we were really interested in how we could look at that idea in people. And my colleague, Chadi Abdullah and Dennis Charney, they did a study then to show that a single dose of ketamine could improve the functional communication between centers of the brain, which is normally reduced in people with depression. So we call that functional connectivity. So ketamine can not only regrow the structure that you can measure in animal studies, the synaptic connections, but it also, in humans, it restores cortical functional connectivity, which you can measure with functional magnetic resonance imaging.
Great, thank you. That's really incredible. So for our last question for you, we were wondering if you had any advice for high school students listening who want to apply to Yale to study neuroscience and psychiatry in the near future.
Sure. Yeah, so the first thing that I would suggest people do is doing exactly what you're doing, which is to go to the website at Yale and read about what's going on in the Department of Psychology, or the Department of Neuroscience, or the Department of Psychiatry, or Department of Neurology, and see some of the things that the faculty are doing. That'll give you a little bit of a feel for the culture, the scientific culture of the university. I think colleges that you're applying to will have a social culture. They'll have a didactic or academic culture, and then they'll also have a scientific culture. And if you're really serious about neuroscience, and if that's your burning passion, it's important, I think, to read about all three of those. One of the things I'll say about Yale is it's particularly good in all three of those areas. They have a wonderful college system where people live together in smaller groups, where they're interacting with faculty and really have a nice kind of supportive community around them that's not too big. They can interact with everybody from all the smaller undergraduate colleges, which are part of the overall Yale College. And there are lots of advisors in those undergraduate, we call them colleges. I think other places would call them dorms or something like that. And people in these undergraduate, there are lots of academic advisors that can help the college students get connected to the laboratories and to the scientists. So you don't have to, when you come to Yale, you don't have to know how everything goes, because there are lots of people who will help you to get connected to the things that you're interested in doing. And then there's a new neuroscience major, or it's a neuroscience, I guess it's a neuroscience major and psychology major that brings people from all over the university and involved in teaching undergraduates. I've gone to a number of the receptions and activities for the neuroscience major undergraduates and met a bunch of them, and they're really smart, talented, and interesting people. And I think another thing I would do if I was in college and interested in coming to Yale for neuroscience in a year that you didn't have COVID would be come and visit and talk to people here, talk to undergraduates. Maybe they have set up ways to talk to undergraduate neuroscience majors and find out what they're into and how they navigate. Every college has something special to offer, and getting to know what it's like to be a student and figuring out what feels like a good match is really important. I don't think there's a single best college, but there may be places where the work going on feels like a particularly good match for the things that you're that you like to do. So the more you know, the more you find out, I think the better decisions you can make about where to go. There are some high school opportunities to get involved in research, and that's always a good way to learn a little bit more about the broader area of neuroscience. But it's not necessary. It's just a way to do something fun.
Yeah, we actually have an interview with a neuroscience major at Yale, like right after this one. So we're really excited to kind of see her perspective on everything as well. So I think, Sasha, do you have any more questions?
I think I'm good, yeah.
All right, so that wraps up our questions for you, Professor Crystal. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us for the College Neuro Network. Your responses were so insightful and will definitely help high school students listening who are researching colleges and are interested in majoring or minoring in neuroscience or psychiatry or even psychology.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And it was really fun to chat, and good luck with your series.
Thank you so
Thank you so
much.
much.